Good. Thank you. There you go. That's the message that we're all waiting for. Good morning. My name is Stella Ursula. I'm the Senior Programs and Partnerships Manager here at the LA office for Grid Alternatives, and very, very excited to be joining you again, to have you join us, and to hear from our experts a little bit about the projects that they're working on and how it relates to the e-truck project as well. So again, you know, the meeting's being recorded. Why don't we go to the meeting agenda? All right, so quick welcome and overview. If you can, please just in the chat, just introduce yourself, name, organization, and you know, anything else you want to include there. And then we're going to go over the project and CTAC overview. That's the Community First Technical Advisory Committee. And then we'll hear about some project updates from our partners. We will have two presentations, one from the EPA and one from CARB. And then we will have a short discussion and feedback. We would love to hear from you during that particular time. We'll also hear about next steps with the e-truck project. Okay, so if we can go to the next slide, let's do quick introductions. I've already introduced myself. Giovanni?
Yes, good morning, everyone. Giovanni Hernandez here, Clean Mobility Program Manager with the Grid Alternatives Greater Los Angeles team. Thank you all so much for joining us.
Thank you, Giovanni. How about this CalStart team?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Tuanchi. I'm a project manager here at CalStart.
Awesome. Thank you, Tuan.
Hi, I'm Giovanna Escamilla. I'm an associate project manager here at CalStart. And yeah, thank you everyone for coming.
Thank you, Giovanna. How about EPRI? Kristen?
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Kristen Bush. I am with the Electric Power Research Institute in their electric transportation team as an engineer scientist. I'm looking forward to the call today.
Thank you, Kristen. Great to have you here. And I saw Shamika introduce herself. Shamika, can you go ahead and join us and just share a little background there?
Hi, everyone. My name is Shamika Dixon, and I am the Director of Workforce Development at Grid Alternatives, and I'm happy to be here and hear all of the great information that's being given today.
Awesome. Thank you, Shamika. I appreciate it. All
I
right.
see Nathan's here, actually.
Oh, Nate, please. Great to have you. Sorry about that.
Hey, everyone. Nate Fernandez. Glad to be here. I'm a lead technical project manager on the CalStart side.
Perfect. Thank you, Nate. All right, if we can go to the next slide, and we'll hear from Tuan. Just Tuan will provide us with a short little project overview.
Thanks, Stella. So for the e-truck project, the purpose is to create a California research hub to facilitate and accelerate the electrification of heavy-duty drayage vehicle market in key areas. And there are several goals and objectives with this project. The first is to advance research, development, and demonstration activities that extend the delivery range of large weight class battery electric trucks, beginning with drayage operations. We also engage broad stakeholders with a community first approach, and we use this input to promote equity and workforce development opportunities in priority communities. These include pollution burden and impacted communities, but also truck fleets, charging equipment and service providers, electric utilities, and planning agencies. Lastly, we plan, deploy, and design innovative, scalable public corridor charging strategies for heavy-duty electric trucks, again, beginning with drayage operations.
Thank you for that overview, Tuan. Appreciate it. Was there anything else? I'm sorry if I cut you off.
No.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And so there might be some folks newer or new to the CTAC, and so I'll just quickly, we do this every meeting. we just provide overview of the goals, objectives, and the function of this particular advisory committee. And so one of our goals was to use a community-first engagement framework to ensure that pollution-impacted, underserved, and tribal communities are involved in creating and guiding this initiative. Really, really important. Our objectives inform the project on community engagement, needs and impact, disseminate and solicit input on project activities from community members and groups, promote equity in priority communities, and foster a community-driven partnership for technology and zero-emission freight corridor development, planning, and site prioritization. And finally, our function is to provide input on the community engagement strategy and equity plan, support equity and community engagement goals, and to inform engagement activities. So just a real quick high-level overview of the work that we have taken on as part of the Community First Technology Advisory Committee. All right, next slide. And so Tuan, I'm going to hand it back to you for overall project updates.
Thanks, Stella. So first we have our industry partner webinar series. Our second webinar, which is on Charging 101, the recording and presentation is live on the website. So if you missed that presentation, it's available for you to view. When it comes to our task 3 activities related to Southern California fleet needs and maturity assessment, we recently published 2 reports, which are also available on our website. The first one is on Tier 1 and original equipment manufacturer interview report. And then the second one is on electric vehicle supply equipment companies, both of their perspective on high power charging. So those are live on our website. When it comes to our lab, our Advanced Transportation Research Center, we've taken delivery of most of the equipment and we aim to have installation of those by the end of the year. When it comes to our high-powered charging lab construction, we're aiming for construction in Q1 of 2024. And when it comes to our pilot sites, we finally have a signed host agreement for our MHX site in Carson. And lastly, with our technology transfer activities, we regularly post on all of our social media accounts on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter with regular updates on the project. So if you're interested, you can scan the QR code here and follow our page. That'll be it for me. I'll pass it back to you, Stella.
Very good. Thank you, Tuan. Perfect. Really appreciate the updates. There's a lot going on behind the scenes, folks. And so we appreciate that you're here, that you're learning about these, all the updates that are going on, and sharing those with your community groups, with your key stakeholders, throughout the region. Really important that you are helping us with these updates. And so I'd like to move right into our presentations. And so we have 2 guest speakers today. And first off, I'll just real quick introduce you both and then hand it over to you. We have John Mickelin, who is the Mobile Source Sublead Coordinator for the Office of Air and Radiation. He's a program coordinator for Clean Air Technology Initiative, an alternative fuel infrastructure lead for the West Coast Collaborative, and all this under the United States Environmental Protection Agency. We also have Yusuf Sardo, who is a air pollution specialist with the Mobile Source Control Division for the California Air Resource Board. So thank you so much, John and Yusuf, for being here today. We really appreciate your presentations. And so I'll hand it off. I believe it's to you, right, John?
Thanks, so Stella. Yes, there we go. Hello, everyone. Again, I'm John McKillen. I work for US EPA. Thank you, Stella, and all the gang at Grid Alternatives, Peppery, and CalCERT for inviting EPA to speak to you all today to share a little bit about what we're working on under our Clean Trucks plan and also give you some background about the seminal statutory authority that EPA is promulgating new vehicle emission standards under. I'm hoping in 20 minutes or less, I'm able to cover the high points, both in the background of our authority and the current activities to mitigate vehicle emissions throughout the United States, both in the heavy duty sector as well as the light and medium duty sector. So with that, next slide, please. So just an outline of what I plan to cover here in the minutes that I have allotted. Just some of the background for our statutory authority for EPA setting vehicle emission standards under Section 202 of the Clean Air Act, the importance of reducing vehicle emissions in the United States, taking a snapshot at our greenhouse gas inventory and the contribution of vehicles to that, and then highlighting Executive Order 14037 signed by President Biden in August of 2021, which has basically initiated a number of different rulemakings at EPA under our Clean Trucks Plan, the three of which are listed here, and I'll go through each one in some depth in the minutes that I have remaining. So next slide. So just foundationally setting, kind of level setting about where EPA and the administrator of EPA get their authority to set emission standards under Section 202 of the Clean Air Act. It authorizes the administrator of the EPA to prescribe regulations and update them from time to time, standards for the emission of any air pollutant from motor vehicles and motor vehicle engines in which his judgment causes or contributes to public health impacts on public health and welfare. And then also, after such a period that he finds necessary to permit development and application of requisite technology, given appropriate consideration to cost of compliance within that period. EPA must also consider technological feasibility, compliance costs, and lead time when setting new standards. And there are a number of other factors that the administrator has the discretion to consider when he or she sets the new emission standards moving forward. And keep in mind that this just applies to new vehicles sold in the United States. So it's just emission standards for model years looking out into the future for vehicles that are certified and registered for sale within the United States. And so you can see here on the right a pie chart of the most recent greenhouse gas inventory for the United States and the contribution of mobile sources to our national greenhouse gases. And you can see that within the transportation sector, on-highway vehicles are the lion's share of greenhouse gases in the United States. And they also are a significant contributor to local and regional air pollution for species such as oxides of nitrogen and fine particulate matter as well. Next slide. So just digging a little bit deeper into the statutory authority, and just to highlight that our authority over vehicle emissions differs by vehicle class and category for criteria pollutant performance emission standards. So Section 202A applies to light duty passenger vehicles and light pickup trucks. Section 202(3)C applies to larger light trucks, medium duty vehicles, and heavy duty vehicles. And the important distinction there is that for the heavier classes of vehicles, including those covered under the e-truck project, we must allow 4 years of lead time and 3 years of stability for the standard under the Act. So when we set a final standard for a heavy duty set of vehicles, we have to give manufacturers 4 years of lead time before those standards become effective. And then they'll have an additional 3 years between the next stringency step in performance. So, for now, we'd basically be setting standards for 2027, and then we wouldn't be able to reduce those emission standards for criteria pollutants until 2030, so on and so forth. And then we also have to consider the greatest degree of emission reductions achievable, taking into appropriate consideration cost, energy, and safety. And if you want to learn more about this section of the Clean Air Act, I've included a direct URL that you can read the actual statutory text if you want to read more about it. But I covered most of the high points in these last 2 slides for purposes of this conversation. Next slide. So referencing our authority under Title II of the Clean Air Act, President Biden in August of 2021 signed Executive Order 14037 entitled Strengthening American Leadership in Clean Cars and Trucks. He highlighted a couple of specific goals under that executive order, including the goal of having 50% of all new passenger car and light truck sales in 2030 be zero emission vehicles, including battery electric, plug-in hybrid, and fuel cell electric vehicles. He also directed that EPA prioritize setting clear standards, support expanding key infrastructure, spurring critical innovation, and investing in the American auto worker. And he also directed for EPA that by July of 2024 that we shall implement new emission standards covering NOx emissions for model year 2027 and newer heavy duty engines and vehicles. We finalized those standards in December of last year. I'll talk a little bit more about those as I go through this briefing. Also seeking to update greenhouse gas emission standards for model year 2027 to 2029 heavy-duty engines and vehicles, those standards were proposed in April. And again, I'll cover those in a little bit of detail later. Set GHG emission standards for model year 2030 and newer heavy-duty engines and vehicles. Also, those were proposed in April. And then set multi-pollutant emission standards for model year 2027 to 2030 plus light and medium duty vehicles, also proposed in April. And a couple of specific coordination directives with the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration and their corporate average fuel economy, or CAFE rule. Clear coordination on the light duty side between EPA and DOT as we both set those emission standards and fuel economy standards that apply to the same classification of vehicles. We're currently doing that. EPA and DOT shall consult with the Secretaries of Commerce, Labor, and Energy as we work to achieve these goals under new regulation. We are actively doing that through interagency work groups and consultation. Coordinate with California and other states that are leading the way on zero emission vehicle technology development, and then also coordinate with stakeholders, including labor union, states, industry, environmental justice organizations, and public health experts. All of these coordination functions are active and ongoing across these different rules. Next slide, please. So just the scope of what I'm going to talk to you about in the remaining slides here in my deck, just to kind of bifurcate the rulemakings that I'll be talking to you about, because there's three different rules that are currently kind of in play under the Clean Trucks Plan and under the executive order. So we have the light and medium duty multi-pollutant standards. So that's really class 1 through 3 vehicles, the types of vehicles that you and I would buy and drive typically are covered. And then smaller delivery vehicles that are last mile for, say, like an Amazon truck coming to your neighborhood or to where your business is located. And then also the heavy duty side covering classes 4 through 8. So the bigger trucks, the types of vehicles that will be covered under the e-truck project for EPRI and CalSTART and Grid Alternatives would be more in this heavier green bar. And I have some pictures kind of to display the types of vehicles that we're talking about. So I just want to make sure you guys understand what the two vehicle classes cover and what these different rulemakings are seeking to mitigate emissions from. Next slide. So here's just some more references and the kind of status of under the Clean Trucks Plan, the three big pieces that EPA is moving forward. The heavy duty 2027 criteria pollutant emission standards, again, we finalized those in December of 2022, and they will be in effect for all US model year 2027 and newer heavy duty on highway engines. And we dramatically reduced criteria pollutant emission performance standard, or I should say increase emissions performance stringency for criteria pollutant from heavy duty engines for NOx, for direct fine particulates, for hydrocarbons, and for carbon monoxide under these standards, dramatically cleaner than what we had under the existing US 2010 standards. We also proposed in April of this year our heavy duty GHG phase 3 emission standards. The comment period for that proposed rule closed on June 16th. So I'll be covering for these last two kind of what was in the proposal back in the spring. And then the light and medium duty multi-pollutant standards, which the comment period closed for that rulemaking on July 5th of this year. Next slide. So just digging a little bit deeper into the criteria pollutant standards. And again, I tried to emphasize the heavy duty rules because that's, I think, more germane to the e-truck project and what you all are focusing on as the CTAC under e-truck. So I tried to kind of emphasize the heavier pieces, and we'll get to the light duty stuff at the end. So for the criteria pollutant standards, there are 4 main pieces of this rulemaking. Again, there's a lot of nuance to this rule, and I only have limited time, so I can't dig too deep into a lot of this. But needless to say, EPA updated our testing procedures for the federal test procedure and the supplemental environmental test procedure for engine certification. We also extended the regulatory useful life for manufacturers to demonstrate that emissions performance dramatically over what had previously existed. We also created more stringent numeric emission performance standards and extended the emissions warranty period to allow consumers greater confidence that the newer emission controls on the vehicle that they're buying is actually going to perform as anticipated when that vehicle and its components were certified for sale in the United States. We really reflected in the docket and also from our own internal understanding that we needed all 4 of these elements to ensure that heavy duty criteria pollutant emissions are mitigated in the real world. And so we sought to strengthen each of these elements in the final rule versus what we had proposed in early 2022. And so the final rule is very complex. There's 4 engine categories with 5 test procedures, and each emission standard each has about 20 different applicable performance metrics within it. So again, I can't touch on all of those now, but all that data is available online if anyone wants to know more about the specifics. Next slide. So just some highlights of kind of what we got from this final rule, which again will be in effect in model year 2027 for all vehicles sold in the United States. Our estimates show that versus a business as usual case nationwide in 2045, that NOx emissions from the heavy duty fleet will be reduced by 48% as a result of this rulemaking. Obviously, that's really significant, reducing heavy duty NOx by almost half nationwide in the next 20 or so years. That's a big win for public health and environmental justice in impacted communities. EPA finalized more stringent pollution standards to reduce emissions from heavy duty vehicles with a single step program becoming effective in 2027. And you can see here just proportionally the comparison of the new standards in 2027 as compared to the current US federal standard for 2027 and newer. So greater than 82% more stringent for NOx, 50% more stringent for PM 2.5, greater than 57% more stringent for hydrocarbons, and greater than 61% more stringent for carbon monoxide, all beneficial for human health. And the final rule does also focus on ensuring that pollution reductions are maintained in the real world by requiring manufacturers to design features that prevent tampering, and also promotes operators to keep emissions controls and engines well maintained and performing. EPA has always conducted extensive stakeholder outreach in the development of this rule with industry, with NGOs, with state agencies, with academia, etc. Next slide. So just shifting gears into greenhouse gases a little bit, wanted to provide a little bit of background on our greenhouse gas emission standards for heavy duty, because it is a bit different than our heavy duty criteria pollutant program. And so we do set vehicle emission standards by vocational class in our GHG program versus in the engine standard, it tends to be by engine classification. For criteria pollutant standards, GHGs tend to be focused more on a full vehicle system. Our phase 1 vehicle standards were implemented from 2014 to 2018. Those were the first set of GHG standards for the heavy duty sector by EPA. And then our phase 2 program was finalized in 2016, but began in model year 2021 and will be fully phased in by model year 2027. And on the right-hand side, you can see a list of some of the technologies that we had anticipated manufacturers would integrate into their products to comply with these more stringent GHG performance standards in that model year phase from 2021 to 2027. Again, they're performance-based standards, so whatever technologies that manufacturers want to deploy that gets them to a certified level of emissions performance, they have the discretion and the flexibility to do that. Next slide. So just a little bit more background on heavy duty phase 3 in terms of what has changed since 2016, because there's been a lot of progress in the heavy duty sector on technology innovation. Most notably on the heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle market. The e-truck is a big piece of that, obviously, and the work that you guys are all doing in California certainly is something that we at EPA are always actively monitoring and engaged in and supporting in many ways through EPA funding. So we recognize that a number of new models have come to market in the heavy-duty sector since we finalized our standards in 2016, that the cost of technologies have reduced and are projected to reduce even further, and that many manufacturers have set goals for ZEV sales in 2020, 2030 and beyond, on the order of 50 to 60% in many markets. And then also we have the enactment of the Inflation Reduction Act and the bipartisan infrastructure law, bringing unprecedented levels of federal investment into the heavy-duty zero-emission vehicle ecosystem. Also actions by states, including the multi-state medium and heavy-duty ZEV MOU signed by 17 states, including California, seeking 100% medium heavy-duty sales by 2050, 30% by 2030 in those jurisdictions. And then, of course, as I'm sure my colleagues from CARB will talk about, the advanced clean truck regulation in greater depth. Next slide, please. Just some highlights on our proposal for phase 3. Again, we're proposing standards for 2027 to model year 2032. We did take comment on standards out to model year 2035 in the rulemaking. We're seeking to align EPA's proposed standards with many of the commitments and investments that have been announced by industry and by many US states, and also many markets internationally. And then also reflecting the bipartisan infrastructure law and the IRA incentives and investments that will be coming out of the federal government over the coming years. Next slide. Just a couple notes on program structure and building off of our phase 2. We do maintain a flexible structure, performance-based structure. It's not a technology mandate. Just a couple of points to note is, again, much like the heavy-duty engine standards, the compliance obligations for OEMs are complex, and there's a number of different vehicle subcategories, 33 in total for our GHG program. So it's not a cut and dry standard like what we have with a light-duty fleet, where you can have like an average fleet CO2 performance metric and have that be your obligation for compliance. It really is by individual heavy-duty vehicle categories, because we understand that the heavy-duty market is not monolithic and that vehicles behave very, very differently, even if they're the same weight class. Their expectation for performance is a lot different. And then also allowing for OEMs to have the flexibility across their product lines to average bank and trade compliance credits, both within their product suite and then amongst the manufacturers. For those that may be beyond compliant, those who may only be producing ZEVs, may be able to sell credits to full line manufacturers who have a combination of both combustion technology and zero emission powertrains. And just one last note here on program structure is that we're not anticipating updating the engine standards beyond what we had done in our 2027 criteria pollutant rule. This will be a vehicle focused set of standards in phase 3. Next slide. Just a couple references and notes. We did hold public hearings in early May. The public comment period closed in June. We are hoping to finalize this rule in the coming months. Again, the president's executive order directs us to finalize this rule by July of next year. We may or may not be earlier than that. There's a lot of things in flux right now, but we are actively working on analyzing the docket, conducting outreach to stakeholders, and having that inform the administrator's final decision on setting these standards moving forward. And if you want to learn more about the proposal, you can click on the link there and read as much as you like about this. Next slide. So the last piece of the Clean Trucks Plan is for our light and medium duty vehicle multi-pollutant emission standards for 2027 and later. And there are 4 parts to this proposal. So there's a lot of substance in here that I'm not going to have the time to get into. But my hope is that I'll be able to give you an overview and hit some of the highlights about what's covered for the light duty and medium duty class. Again, for the e-truck project, this is less relevant, but since it's part of the EPA Clean Trucks Plan and also pursuant to our implementation of the executive order and implementation of the administrator's authority under Title II, I figured it would be appropriate to cover it here. Next slide. I'm sorry about the formatting here. It doesn't seem to have come out clearly, but it's basically, this is the light duty CO2 standards for 2027 through 32 as proposed. And for those who aren't familiar with these standards, they are a footprint-based set of CO2 emission performance standards. And so the larger a vehicle is, the less stringent the performance standard is required. And so in this rulemaking, we recognize that because of that structure, it was skewing the US vehicle market towards larger vehicles because it was easier for OEMs to comply, and also consumers in general have preferred larger vehicles in the United States. So under this proposal, we're looking to flatten the curve. And we want to make sure that for larger light passenger cars and larger light trucks, that you can see the slope, which is the one to focus on here is that bottom line. That's the proposal for 2032. That's kind of the end of the proposed compliance schedule and the performance stringency that we're aiming for. You can see that the slope of those curves becomes a lot flatter for both passenger cars on the left and then for pickup trucks on the right. Pickup trucks still are going to be a bit higher, but they do have a work utility factor built in. They have to have towing capability. They are heavier by nature, so they're not always going to be as efficient as a passenger car, but you can see that they're coming a lot closer now. And we also are allowing OEMs to integrate battery electric vehicles as part of their compliance schedule and the amalgam of different products that they will make available for sale to comply with these standards moving forward. Next slide. So here you see a projected fleet average across the alternatives and EPA's proposal. So there's 4 different scenarios in the proposal for CO2. There's EPA's proposal, and then there's 3 different alternatives. You can see how they vary a little bit based on the line graph here. You can see that, you basically have a variance of most stringent to least stringent, with our proposal being kind of somewhere in the middle. And then you can see some notes in plain language as to what our proposal really means. And so I like to always think about where we are today with rules that are on the books versus where we're proposing for the end of this compliance schedule. I think that gives the public the clearest picture about what EPA is proposing. And so ultimately, versus the existing 2026 standard, our model year 32 proposed standard would be 56% more stringent than the existing standard for model year 2026. In only 6 model years, that's a significant improvement in performance and a dramatic reduction in CO2. And you can see here in that blue chart there at the top, 2026, 186 grams per mile CO2 to 82 grams per mile in 2032. That's a dramatic reduction. That's really unprecedented for EPA in this program to go that far, that fast. And you can see also here, interpreted slightly differently, the percentages by model year, year over year stringency increases for both the EPA proposal and all the different alternatives. I'm not going to go into any more detail here in the interest of time, but the slide will be available as a reference for you all if you want to dig into the numbers a little bit more. Next slide. And also the medium duty CO2 standards, again, a little bit different because there's a work factor involved with class 2B and class 3 vehicles, which are also part of this package. And so you can see here kind of what the current standards are and what we're kind of proposing in a projected fleet-wide combined across vans and pickups, because those are the 2 major classifications in medium duty. And you can see that in 2032 versus the current standard for model year 26, we're proposing a 44% improvement in stringency or reduction in emissions, depending on how you want to interpret that. But it's basically a 44% improvement over the current standard, which is significant for medium duty vehicles, particularly given the growth of last mile delivery in response to e-commerce since the COVID-19 pandemic has begun. Next slide. Just on the criteria pollutant, there's really only one proposal that we put out for comment across the different pollutants covered under this program. So I'm just going to touch on some of the highlights for light duty and medium duty. So NMOG, or VOCs in kind of California parlance, NMOG is kind of usually how I try to refer to it, or hydrocarbons. A 60% reduction in 2032 versus 2026. And then for medium duty, depending on which class of vehicle you're examining, a 66 to 76% reduction versus the current standard. And then also adding a cold start NMOG plus NOx standard to ensure control over a broader range of operating conditions. And then also dramatically improving our PM standards for vehicles, 95% reduction over the current standard. And this, if we finalize the standard as proposed, would be even more stringent than the California Advanced Clean Car 2 PM standard for light duty vehicles. And obviously for environmental justice communities impacted by human exposure to fine particulates, this is a huge win for human health if we're able to finalize standards at this level. And maybe, one of the more impactful elements of this multi-pollutant standard for light and medium duty vehicles. And I think that might be my last substantive slide. Next one. Yeah, just a couple notes on timeline and status. We did hold a virtual public hearing in mid-May. Our comment period closed on July 5th. And like with the heavy duty phase 3 program, we're currently working to finalize these standards in the next few months. And going through the docket, meeting with stakeholders, and making sure that the administrator has all the best available data to make his final determination for these standards, which obviously, given the recent labor dispute between UAW and the domestic manufacturers, there's a lot of new dynamics that have come to light since the docket closed in July. So we're trying to navigate all those new elements as we try to give the administrator and the president the best information to make the final decision on. Next slide. I think the last one's just my contact information. And yeah, there we go. I hope I'm not too far over time, Stella. I hope I hit the mark. And I think I can kick it over to my colleagues at CARB.
Right on, John. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Yes, and Yusuf, you want to take over?
Thank you, Stella, and thank you for having us. So I'll go ahead and get started. So the focus of my presentation is going to be on medium and heavy duty zero emission vehicle regulations as it pertains to CARB. Again, my name is Yusuf Zardo. I'm an air pollution specialist here at California Air Resources Board, and I work for the Mobile Source Control Division in the Compliance Assistance and Outreach section. Next slide, please. So some of the topics that I'll be covering today are going to be just a brief background of emission regulations, current status of truck regulations, advanced clean fleets regulation overview, which is what I've been working on, and then some future truck regulations. Next slide, please. So background of emission regulations. Emission regulations are designed to achieve air quality standards and protect public health. In 1967, the California Air Resources Board, or CARB, was created. CARB is a state agency responsible for regulating air pollution in California. The creation of CARB was to address the state's air pollution problem, which was particularly severe in Los Angeles at the time. Then in 1970, the Clean Air Act passed by the United States Congress. The passing of the Clean Air Act set into motion a nationwide effort to improve the country's air quality. The passing of the Clean Air Act also allowed EPA to regulate air pollution from motor vehicles. Since then, additional laws and regulations have been added, including the 1990 amendments to the Clean Air Act. When the Clean Air Act was passed, California was already developing innovative laws and standards to address its unique air pollution problems. So Congress carved out an exemption. This allows California to adopt its own California-specific and more stringent standard. CARB has been granted waivers by the US EPA to enforce its own standards since 1970s. Other states can choose to adopt California's standards under certain conditions. Next slide, please. So biggest trucks have the highest emissions. Reducing air pollution is critical to protecting the health of Californians. Much of the air pollution and greenhouse gas emissions in California come from the transportation sector, with medium and heavy-duty trucks being among the highest emitters. Trucks can come in many different configurations and sizes, and there are nearly 2 million trucks operating in California. However, Class 7 and Class 8 tractors have a disproportionate share of emissions burdening communities living near freight hubs. They account for about 12% of the total truck population, but they represent about 48% of the daily NOx emissions. NOx is one of the main compounds that form smog. To meet California's health-based air quality standards and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, the trucks and buses operated in the state and the fuel they use must be moved away from petroleum. California is working to meet the governor's goal of 100% zero-emission transportation where feasible by 2045. Next slide. These are CARB's regulation affecting medium and heavy-duty vehicle fleets. As you can see, we have a lot of regulations that affect medium and heavy-duty vehicles. Some of these regulations are designed to clean up the fleet, such as the truck and bus regulation. With the truck and bus regulation, we have up to 95% compliance rate, which is great. Then we have the Clean Truck Check regulation, or heavy duty inspection and maintenance program, which we recently passed. It'll be going into effect next year. The Clean Truck Check program requires vehicle owners to test their emissions twice a year and submit those results to CARB, which ensures that trucks stay as clean as possible. Next, we're moving towards zero-emission vehicle regulation, such as the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation and the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, that clean up the fleets even more. Next slide, please. Measures to clean up heavy-duty vehicles. The board has taken many key steps to reduce medium and heavy-duty vehicle emissions. This slide reviews some of the newer measures to clean up heavy-duty vehicles. Zero emission began with regulations to transit buses in 2018 and airport shuttles in 2019. In 2020 and 2021, the board adopted 3 major truck regulations. The Advanced Clean Trucks regulation will ensure a supply of new zero-emission trucks from major manufacturers. The heavy-duty omnibus regulation will reduce criteria pollutant emissions from internal combustion engines sold in California. And the heavy-duty inspection and maintenance program, or Clean Truck Check, will ensure combustion engines and their emissions control systems are maintained and repaired timely. The Advanced Clean Fleets regulation, highlighted in the red box, is the next step to drive commercialization of zero-emission vehicles in fleets that are best suited to lead the way. Finally, last September, the board adopted the state implementation plan that includes the regulation and a new zero-emission truck measure, which emphasizes that more is still needed to achieve federal attainment standards. For the sake of this presentation, I won't be going into all of these regulations, but I'll be focusing more on the zero-emission regulation. Next slide, please. Okay, so the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation. The Advanced Clean Truck Regulation ensures the supply of available zero-emission vehicles will continue to grow in the upcoming years. It requires manufacturers to sell zero-emission vehicles as a growing percentage in all vehicle classes starting in 2024. So an 8,500-pound gross vehicle weight rating, to give you an idea what type of vehicle that would be, it would be more like a Ford F-350 or a Ram 3500, Chevrolet 3500 on up, all the way up to Class 8, which is the semis. Next slide. So the Advanced Clean Truck Regulation was approved in 2020 and will result in approximately 320,000 zero-emission trucks being deployed in California by 2035. Next slide, please. So Advanced Clean Trucks, California is first, but not alone when it comes to deploying zero-emission vehicles. There are currently 12 other states that have adopted California's light-duty Advanced Clean Cars regulation and 9 other states that have adopted our medium and heavy-duty Advanced Clean Trucks regulation. The Advanced Clean Trucks states comprise about a quarter of the U.S. new heavy-duty vehicle sales revenue. In addition, 17 states, including the District of Columbia and the province of Quebec, Canada, have signed a memorandum of understanding committing to electrification across both medium and heavy-duty vehicle sectors. As you can see on the map, all the West Coast states and Nevada have adopted the Advanced Clean Trucks regulation and have committed to zero-emission vehicle deployments, which helps support infrastructure build-out. Next slide. So we're moving into the Advanced Clean Fleets regulation. The Advanced Clean Fleets regulation has 4 main components which complement each other. On the manufacturer side, a 100% zero-emission vehicle sales requirement by 2036. And 3 requirements on dray trucks, state and local government fleets, and high-priority fleets. Next slide, please. So the first component is the 100% sales, zero-emission vehicle sales requirement. Starting in 2036, all Class 2B, which is around the Ford F-350 up to Class 8 vehicles sold in California must be zero-emission vehicles. Next slide, please. The second component of the Advanced Clean Fleet regulation requirement is for high priority and federal fleets. This portion of the regulation applies to well-capitalized businesses well-suited for electrification. The requirements apply to fleets with 50 or more vehicles under common ownership and control, or any fleet greater than 50 million in revenue, as well as federal government agencies. There are additional requirements on brokers and motor carriers to ensure that they are hiring compliant fleets. In addition to Class 2B through Class 8 vehicles, this requirement applies to off-road yard tractors, light-duty delivery vehicles, such as those operated by the Postal Service. Next slide, please. So state and local government requirements. The third component is the state and local government fleets. The default option is a zero-emission purchase requirement that aligns with public fleet purchasing cycles. Starting in 2024, 50% of purchases must be zero emissions. That means the other half can be combustion powered until 2027. However, agencies that are in designated counties will remain exempt from zero emission purchase requirements until 2027. This exemption also has been granted to divisions that have 10 or fewer vehicles. And those are designated on the map on the right-hand side in red, those counties. Starting in 2027, all purchases made would need to be zero emission or near zero emissions. In this structure, if no vehicles are being purchased, then no action is required. This means that fleets can continue to operate their vehicles as long as they wish. Both the high priority fleets and the state and local governments can also opt into a zero emission vehicle milestone option. Next slide, please. The fourth component of the Advanced Clean Fleet requirement is the drayage truck requirement, which applies to tractors operating at the state's seaports and rail yards. This requirement will create a fully zero-emission drayage fleet by 2035. To conduct drayage operations in California, trucks must be registered in the CARB's online reporting system. Legacy drayage trucks will be able to remain in drayage service until the end of their minimal useful life. So the minimal useful life of a vehicle will be no more than 800,000 miles or 18 years, whichever comes first. Then beginning January 1st, 2024, only zero-emission trucks can be added to the registration system. Starting in 2025, legacy trucks that have exceeded their useful life must be removed from drayage service. And in 2035, all trucks must be zero emissions. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned in previous slides, the 2022 state implementation plan identifies a future zero emission truck measure to move the rest of California trucking fleet to zero emission vehicles, with a 2028 anticipated board date and a 2030 plus implementation timeframe. This will allow California to reach the governor's goal of zero emission vehicles by 2045. Next slide, please. We do have a lot of resources on our websites for medium and heavy duty fleets. We have multiple fact sheets. We have a searchable frequently asked questions, a fleet calculator, and we have a zero emission vehicle truck stop webpage. A lot of this information is located on our zero emission truck stop webpage. You can easily search it by looking through or typing on your favorite search engine, CARB ZEV truck stop, and it'll take you to the page where we have several resources, including all those that I just mentioned. Next slide, please. So lastly, we do have the Advanced Clean Fleet homepage, where we have a lot of this regulation information. We've set up an Advanced Clean Fleet email. It's zevfleet@arb.ca.gov. That's for anyone that has any questions regarding our Advanced Clean Fleet regulation, can send us an email and we'll respond to that. We've set up a truck stop homepage where we have several resources available. And we also have our truck stop hotline to help answer any questions from fleets of medium and heavy duty vehicles. So that concludes my slide. I believe the last one. Yes, that's it. And with that, I'll hand it back to you, Stella.
Thank you, Yusuf. That was fantastic. We really appreciate such thorough presentations from you and from John. And I'm thinking about, okay, how do we take this information and bring it to the communities that are most impacted by the goods movement? And so you've given us so much information here. Thank you so much. And all the links to additional resources are really helpful. So we have some questions for you. And let's see. I think we have them on the slides. One more. There we go. No, sorry. We have a couple of questions here that we would like to ask you. And so number one, what is the process for setting and revising emission standards? And how do you consider feedback from various stakeholders, including environmental groups, OEMs, and the public? So John or Yusuf, whoever wants to take that.
I'll jump on, and I know I wasn't giving the presentation. Yusuf and I worked together, but
Thank you,
I'm going to
Bruce.
jump on and
Appreciate
talk
it.
about that a little bit. Yeah, no problem. So we do. If you followed our advanced clean fleet rulemaking process at all, you'll know that it took us about 3 years to do that. A big part of the reason is that we do exactly what this question is kind of getting at, is we work with all parties to try and understand the needs, understand the technologies, and understand, again, what we need to do. And when I say all parties, I can't begin to tell you how many meetings I sat in on with not only manufacturers and fleets, environmental justice groups, you name it, across the board. So we take all of that information and, basically go back, develop a regulation from it, develop the basis of the regulation, I should say. Then we go into our workshop process. And again, I don't even recall, but we had probably, oh my goodness, probably around half a dozen workshops over about a 2-year period once we were ready to start actually rolling out what we thought the rule might look like. And of course, that process, we go back and forth with all the stakeholders I just mentioned. And then we'll come back with the possible revisions to that regulation. So that's really kind of how we incorporate that feedback. And again, that's really critical to our rule development process.
Wonderful. Thank you. Really appreciate that. We have another question, unless there's another response there.
Yes, Stella, if I may, on behalf of EPA,
Thank you.
it is a bit different. Our processes for administrative law proceedings between the federal government and the state of California do differ in some very important ways. So I think it's important to highlight that here. First off, at the career level where I am, staff at my level who work on technology advancement, we're always working with industry, NGOs, academia to assess what the current state of play is for technologies to mitigate emissions. So that work goes on each and every day. But what's really important from a regulatory perspective is leadership, right? It unlocks that brain trust to be able to actually do work and advance policies that actually put those learnings into functional practice, right? So I think under this current group of leadership, under President Biden and Administrator Regan, our marching orders have been very clear as to what we're supposed to be doing and when they want things done by. And it makes it pretty straightforward as to, the clean trucks plan that I just kind of went through in some detail. EPA staff in our mobile source groups are always looking for opportunities to further mitigate emissions and improve public health by reducing mobile source emissions. But we need a clear set of directives from our political leadership to allow us to actually pursue those policies. So, and then in terms of the engagement process, once we've initiated that, right? So it's like, we're always working collaboratively with industry, NGOs, academia to get a good data set to build and inform policy on. But then once we're actually developing policy, our process is typically, we'll have some informal stakeholder meetings. We'll have one or more public hearings, right, to encourage folks to be on the record and state their piece for what they want us to do. And then we'll have a docket that opens for a given period of time. And then once that docket closes, the opportunity for us to take active input is much more constrained, right? I mean, it's basically like everyone's waiting for the final rules on the last two pieces that I talked about in the EPA Clean Trucks Plan. And then the recourse from that is for folks to either file a petition for reconsideration or to, if they choose to, litigate on the validity and merit of the standards if they want to challenge any of EPA's logic either technically or legally, in promulgating those rules. I would say that aside from leadership within the federal government at the political level, there's also external leadership that happens to help initiate these rulemaking proceedings as well. And on the criteria pollutant heavy duty standards that I talked about earlier, that leadership came from the South Coast Air Quality Management District and the California Resources Board. They petitioned EPA in 2016 to set more stringent criteria pollutant standards for heavy duty engines. We responded to that petition, and we initiated a number of different technical work groups internally to try to develop rules. Now, due to regime change at the White House, that effort oscillated back and forth over several years. But we finally got to a point in December of last year where we delivered on the promise of that petition that was sent to the administrator of EPA all those years ago, and actually delivered heavy duty engines. So it's a little bit different in terms of like how EPA gets the impetus for developing new vehicle emission standards versus kind of how CARB does their thing. And then also in the process of developing their rules, CARB has a much more robust kind of workshop process than EPA tends to have. We tend to have like that one hearing and then people on the record in the docket, and that's kind of it. And there may be some informal meetings that happen to supplement those. So I just wanted to kind of highlight some examples and kind of how the processes differ.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, John. Appreciate it. Excuse me. And you might have started to answer this next question. Excuse me. What efforts are being made to ensure that emission regulations don't disproportionately affect disadvantaged or underserved communities in the project area? And how can community members ensure that environmental justice is a priority? And that's for both CARB and the EPA.
Yeah, you know, I mean, environmental justice is critical to CARB and to the state of California, to the governor and pretty much every state agency. But I actually want to kind of turn this around a tiny bit. And John, you did a really good job in your presentation about mentioning the fact that what we do really has some very significant impacts on environmental justice communities. We didn't cover it too much in our presentation, but as you looked at how we develop some of those regulations, we start, and we always have, based on a couple of ideals. What we look at is what's kind of easiest to do first. You saw transit vehicles were one of the first zero emission, actually the first zero emission regulation. Transit vehicles are perfect. They run a relatively fixed route. They stop and recharge. And where are they operating? They're operating in our neighborhoods, right? They're big vehicles. They were a perfect place to start to help prove the technology and to get that technology more widespread. When you look at our advanced clean fleet regulation, really the first impacted set of vehicles are drayage vehicles. And there really aren't any more highly polluted areas in the state of California than around places like rail yards, ports, and then the associated warehouses that go with those. So we build into our regulations really as early and as effective reductions in really communities that are heavily impacted. And of course, then I mentioned we meet with all kinds of groups, whether it be in our workshop process. Out of that workshop, the more informal meetings, as like John mentioned with EPA, and EJ groups are critical in that process, giving us feedback to help us form those regulations.
Thank you for that, Bruce. And it kind of leads to the next question that we had for you. In cases where a community experiences higher levels of pollution due to factors such as traffic congestion or industrial activities, how are emission standards and monitoring adapted to address these specific challenges? And again, to both teams.
Yeah, just before we get to that one, Stella, just in response to the previous question.
Yes.
You know, I would say more than at any other time in EPA's history, you know, EJ is kind of at the core of everything we're trying to do, and trying to make up for a lot of lost time in addressing environmental inequities across the country, particularly in those communities on the West Coast that are impacted by goods movement. I mean, I think a lot of what I talked to you all about in my prepared remarks is about addressing those societal inequities that EPA is all too familiar with. And we've been trying to correct for a very long time. And every rulemaking that we do, communities who are impacted disproportionately by those emissions are at the kernel of why we're doing that. And so every technology that we evaluate, every rule and certification test procedure that we try to implement is all with an eye towards how do we mitigate human exposure to harmful pollution, but particularly across the country, but particularly in those communities that have a large number of these sources that have historically impacted them and that are actively impacting them day to day. And so I think more so than at any other time, our regulatory impact analyses, and for those of you who do want to dig a little bit deeper into the heavy duty rulemakings that I discussed, you can look in the RIAs of the heavy duty rules, both for the proposal for phase 3 and then the final rule for the 27 criteria pollutant standards, to look at some of the demographic analyses that EPA has conducted to support these rules and how our projections on near roadway exposures and the demographics of the people that are going to benefit from reductions in near roadway exposures are much more granular in the demographic data layers than in any previous analyses that EPA has done. And that's largely at the direction of the administrator. I mean, Administrator Regan, it's part of his core set of principles to make sure that the efforts of this agency are put towards the objective of addressing environmental injustice in every rule that we do, in every project that we consider for funding, and that will continue to be true. And in terms of what the e-truck does, right? I mean, we're talking about zero emission heavy duty truck technology. That to me is like the definition of an environmental injustice strategy. Like getting zero emission trucks on the road, no matter where they are, you're improving environmental and health outcomes versus exposure to diesel combustion, right? Even at a low emission rate, it's a lot higher than a zero emission tailpipe rate. And so, think about what the e-truck's doing and the technologies that EPRI and CalSTART and Grid Alternatives are trying to develop in partnership with other industry as tools to try to address this very same set of issues. And so I'll just respond to that. And then on that other question, I'll punt it back over to Bruce. This is the issue around monitoring and tailoring emission standards for individual communities is really a challenging one because the statutory authority that we tend to operate under isn't drafted in that way typically. But in terms of monitoring strategies, I would have to defer to those who are more expert in that area than myself, including those at California's relevant air districts who have near roadway monitoring networks that actually evaluate data quality assurance, location of monitors, and what pollutant species they're actually seeking to track over time. But for my part at the agency, that's certainly outside of my core competency.
Thank you, John. Appreciate that. Bruce or Yusuf, any additional?
Sure, and I know we're really close to time, so I'll make it
Yes.
pretty quick. John's absolutely right about the monitoring. There is not only a very robust monitoring network operated by local air districts, there are CARB monitoring stations as well. As John said, I don't work in our monitoring and laboratory division, so I'm not an expert on how those areas adjust or how those different departments adjust their monitoring. I do know that those monitors and monitoring sites are constantly being evaluated, and they'll look at things like traffic flows and so forth. But as far as what else happens on the ground to help mitigate impacts of emissions, a lot of that really does come down to what can be done at the local district level, and not just local districts, but local planning commissions and so forth to mitigate traffic impacts. One thing I can tell you that I know a little bit about, is South Coast Air Quality Management has their independent source review regulation, and that's exactly what that's to do. Is it requires some kind of emission offset, mitigation, whatever you want to call it, in response to something such as a warehouse increasing truck traffic in an area. So again, that really is something that is more localized than what CARB would oversee.
Thank you for that, Bruce. Appreciate it. We had one more question, but I'm going to move on to the discussion question so that our CTAC members can engage here. And so we were thinking about this. What other data and research would you like to know? Thank you for sharing this. Would you like to know regarding health and economic impacts of emissions to help us solicit feedback on this project? And are there any other topics we missed this past year that will help you make informed decisions? So this goes out to the group here at large. You know, other data or research that you think we should be looking for. And I'm looking for hands. Giovanni, I'm not sure if you see anybody's hand up.
Not yet.
Okay. Any other topics we missed this past year that will help you and all of us make informed decisions? Don't see any hands. Well, we can come back to this. You know, I can open the floor up to any and all questions for John and for Yusuf and
I do see that John has his hand up.
John.
Yeah, I was just going to say in response to your question about data, you know, and to their credit at CARB, they really maintain a good public resource for their Clean Air Almanac. And so for those of you who aren't familiar with that resource, it really does provide a very localized set of emissions inventory data to familiarize yourselves with. And I'm sure you could invite relevant staff at CARB to brief you all and kind of give you an overview, or if there's specific communities that you want to learn more about. But, you know, to their credit, they've maintained that resource for a very long period of time. So it's good to compare over a time series for individual communities, like what the benefits have been from all the activities that Yusuf and Bruce were just talking about. So just one thing, if you guys want to kind of get into the weeds on data analysis of emissions in particular parts of California, there's certainly resources to leverage for that purpose.
Awesome. Thank you for that, John. Let's see. I don't see any more hands here. We did have one other question while we're just double checking to see if anyone has any last questions here. The question was, can you provide details on ongoing or upcoming projects that are specifically aimed at impacting the environmental conditions along the 710 corridor? And are there any new grant funding opportunities similar to the E-Truck project that stakeholders on this call should be aware of? And I put that out to
Bruce, I think you're muted.
Yusuf?
The words of the new millennia, right? You're on mute. Thank you. I can speak at least to the incentive piece of that a little bit. And first of all, as far as projects, as I said earlier, a lot of that is on a more local basis. And I think that's what you'd find there is, you know, specific projects. Additionally, especially when it comes to things such as infrastructure, our partners over at CEC are overseeing a lot of that. So some of those folks may be a little better to speak to those things. However, on the incentive sides, there are certainly incentives that aim at the very types of trucks and the neighborhoods around an area such as the 710 corridor. First of all, there is funding carved out specifically for drayage trucks to try and turn those over and to provide those, especially the small fleet owners, you know, that may be having a more difficult time turning over to zero emission on the schedule that CARB has set for them, to provide them with some incentive funding to help turn over those vehicles. When it comes to things such as funding for infrastructure projects, there are lanes that are set up in the California Energy Commission, CEC's funding program specifically for disadvantaged communities that will help provide infrastructure funding, incentive funding in most cases, to areas that are heavily impacted by air pollution and therefore need that additional help. So a lot of the funding sources that we also have funding sources aimed specifically at small fleets. And in many cases, small fleets are the owners of small fleets are members of disadvantaged or underserved communities. So a lot of our funding programs really are aimed straight at, and the district has a wonderful funding, many wonderful funding programs, but South Coast also has a great program aimed really at small fleets and drayage trucks specifically. So again, a lot of our programs are aimed to get vehicles, the dirtier vehicles, out of areas that are most heavily impacted.
Perfect. Thank you for that, Bruce.
Sure.
And Stella, I would just say EPA has an unprecedented amount of clean air funding coming out of our agency in response to the Inflation Reduction Act. Also, the Department of Energy and Department of Transportation also have a number of new programs under the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and IRA that can address air quality related strategies. So I sent Giovanni a laundry list of stuff via email before today's meeting. So I'm hoping he can leverage those resources for you all and that you guys can stay abreast of all the new funding opportunities. I have to say, as a member, I've been at the EPA 14 years, and this is like drinking from a fire hose in terms of like standing up all these new programs.
Yeah.
You know, $42 billion in new funding for EPA. That's like 4 times our annual budget. We usually get around $10 billion a year for EPA total. And this is one time across a bunch of new programs, getting them up, running, and out within a year, and then getting the funding committed is going to be a huge undertaking. And so for those of you in California, I know there's going to be a little bit of application fatigue in the next year between state, local, and federal programs, but now is the time. It really is. The iron is super hot. It's time to strike, and be prepared to get your grant writing pencils sharpened and ready to go. And don't plan to take any vacations in the springtime, because that's going to be really when, you know, between January and May is really going to be the time when all these applications are likely going to be coming due. And just be prepared to start writing and get as many of them as you possibly can. Both on the technology and clean air side, but also a bunch of new EJ-oriented programs are going to be coming out of EPA and have already come out. And so just stay tuned. There's going to be a lot on the horizon coming out of EPA that groups like this can leverage.
Yeah, absolutely, John. Thank you for that. And, you know, I think that's what we're all feeling right now. There's this huge plethora of grants and projects out there that we're hearing about. And so we're just trying to get ready. We're trying, you know, just to be prepared so that we can tap into some of these funds, some of these projects. We're looking for our project partners, our grant partners. So get ready, everybody. I'm feeling that every day compared to last year. It's like, wow, this is overwhelming. And your analogy, you know, drinking out of a fire hose, spot on right now. So anyone else have any questions, comments before we move on? If not, Giovanni, if you want to go ahead and start with our closing items. And again, thank you to John and Youssef and Bruce. We really appreciate it. Just some very thorough presentations. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Take care.
All right.
Yeah, thanks again for the invitation, Stella.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, and again, I want to express my gratitude to the EPA and CARB, Youssef, Bruce, and John here, our guest presenters for today. Again, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. And John, I do want to confirm I did receive your email of the host of grant funding opportunities. I will make sure to send actually an email today to everyone. All those links you send me so that folks can take a look at it and dive into it and apply for whatever makes sense for them. I'll make sure to do that today so folks receive that today in their inboxes. You know, in a couple of weeks, we'll be following up as well with just the meeting summary of today's meeting and a link to the recording and a copy of the PowerPoint presentations. So that'll be a separate email, but I'll make sure today to everyone on the CTAC to that they receive those links to those grant funding opportunities. And then just other closing items. Wanted to let everyone know that our next quarterly CTAC meeting for the next year, right? This is the last one for this 2023 calendar year. And the next one for the first for the 2024 calendar year will take place on February 28th, same time, 10 a.m. So we'll make sure to send out calendar invites at the end of the year for all the quarterly CTAC meetings that are scheduled for the 2024 calendar year. So we'll be sending that out to everyone, before the holidays, right? And we're also determining when the next industry partner webinar series will take place. We will resume that webinar series in 2024 as well. So stay tuned for a date in Q1 of next year for that next particular webinar. That's open to the public, right? So we encourage you to promote those to all your stakeholders and community members that you all work with. And then lastly, yep, that's it. That's all that's it on my end. Just wanted to show everyone our contact information as well. So next slide for our email contact information there for the team. So anyone can reach out to us there. So that's it. So yeah, next slide, just to show our emails briefly for folks. There you go. Yep. Other than that, again, I just want to thank our presenters and thank everyone that took the time to be here today to join us. I don't know if anyone else has any other closing remarks. Next slide as well.
I think we're all good.
All right. So with that, thank you all so much, and feel free to reach out to us with any questions that you may have.
Right on. Thanks, everyone. We
Take
appreciate
care.
your time. Have a
Bye-bye.
great day.
Thanks
Bye-bye.
again. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.